In 1998, my daughter wore a black top and white skirt to the cruise ship's formal night. She was glowing. The last photo I ever took of her, she's got that easy smile, the kind only a 20-something with her whole life ahead of her can pull off. That night she danced until almost dawn with her younger brother. He went to bed. She stayed out a bit longer, and somewhere between the lull of ocean waves and the first light hitting the water, Rachel disappeared. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments. And if you've ever had a feeling you couldn't shake something small that wouldn't leave you alone, tap like and subscribe. Every person who listens helps carry Rachel's name a little farther. My name's Linda Massey. I was 47 back then. Born and raised in Roanoke, Virginia, where we never locked the doors until the early 2000s. My husband Tom had just retired from the fire department. Rachel, our daughter, had just finished college, and we wanted one last family trip before she started her new job in Richmond. We booked a 7-day Caribbean cruise, just the four of us. Me, Tom, Rachel, and our son Brian. It was supposed to be simple sunrest and time together. Rachel had always been bright, athletic, played basketball all 4 years. But more than that, she was cautious. Never the kind of girl to do something reckless just to chase a thrill. From the moment we boarded, I noticed the way some of the crew looked at her. It wasn't subtle. I'm a mother, I know the difference between a polite smile and a stare that lingers a little too long. At first I told myself I was being protective. She was an adult. She could handle herself. Still, I found myself watching the hallways a little closer. There was one man in particular, one of the band members who played in the ship's lounge. He went by a nickname, something odd like Sunny or Shade, I don't remember now, but I do remember how he hovered, not in an obvious way, just always nearby. That third night we all had dinner together, lobster tails and champagne. Rachel looked so grown up sitting there next to her dad. Afterward, she and Brian went dancing at the club near the upper deck. I stayed behind and read for a while, then drifted off to sleep around 3. When I woke up, it was just after 6. The curtains were open, and the room was bathed in that soft early light that only comes over the water. Brian was snoring. Tom was still asleep. But Rachel's bed, it was empty. Her shoes were still there. So were her cigarettes, her ID. Even the room key card was on the dresser. At first, I told myself maybe she'd gone for coffee or stepped out for some air. But something didn't feel right. Rachel was always the one to leave a note, even just a quick be right back. That morning, there was nothing. And for the first time since the trip began, I realized I couldn't hear the ocean. Only silence. At first, I told myself not to panic. Maybe she was up on deck watching the sunrise. Rachel loved that quiet time of morning, the in-between light when the sky wasn't sure what it wanted to be. But it was already past 6, and something about the stillness in that room didn't sit right. Her bed looked barely touched, sheets pulled back like she'd just stepped out for a minute. But her flip-flops were lined up under the edge, and her pack of cigarettes and lighter were sitting right there on the nightstand next to her ID. Her room key was still in the little dish by the mirror, same place she always left it. That's when I felt it in my chest, this low, dull weight. Like I knew I wasn't going to find her in any of the usual places. I slipped out, quietly, didn't wake Tom or Brian. Walked the length of deck 10 past the coffee bar, the pool, the rows of chairs nobody had touched yet. I checked the railing, thinking maybe she'd leaned out too far. Nothing. I looked down at the water and had to pull myself back. Then I checked the little buffet area, the gym, even the tiny library near the internet cafe. Nothing. By the time I made it back to the room, Tom was awake. He could tell by my face. I didn't even have to say it. He called the front desk while I got Brian up. They transferred him 3 times before someone even seemed to take it seriously. "Maybe she went ashore early," the woman said. That didn't make any sense. We hadn't docked yet. I remember Tom snapping back, then explain how she got off the ship with no ID. We dressed fast and went straight to guest relations, thinking maybe there'd been some mistake or she'd checked in somewhere and we just didn't get the message. But the crew's reaction wasn't what I expected. Not urgent. Not even concerned. They told us she was an adult and probably just sleeping in somewhere or decided to be alone for a bit. One of the men behind the counter said something like, "You'd be surprised how many people just need a little space." By then, we were docked at Curacao. Passengers were lining up to head out for excursions. We asked the ship to make a public announcement, just something over the intercom, asking Rachel to check in. They refused, said it wasn't their policy unless there was a confirmed emergency. I told them my daughter was gone. That should have been enough. Tom started checking cabins. Not barging in, just knocking, asking if anyone had seen a young woman with dark hair, 5'8" athletic build, wearing a black top and white skirt. Brian walked every deck twice, circling the pool, the lounges, the clubs. Meanwhile, I stood at the exit ramp, watching every single person leave the ship. I still don't know what I was hoping for. Maybe I thought she'd suddenly show up in a baseball cap and say it was all a misunderstanding. But I didn't see her. Then a woman approached us, said she thought she might have seen Rachel earlier that morning around 6. She was near the elevators on deck 7 walking with a man. Said the guy looked familiar, maybe part of the entertainment crew. That narrowed it down fast. The only crew member Rachel had spent time with was the bass player from the ship's band. He'd introduced himself the night before as Jace, but everyone seemed to call him by a nickname something like Yellow. That caught Brian's attention. He'd been with her in the lounge until about 3:30 a.m. Said she'd danced most of the night, mostly with Yellow and a few others from the band. They were just talking and laughing. Nothing strange. But after they got back to the room, she stayed up. Brian crashed right away. We brought all of this to security, expecting them to jump into action. Check cameras, locate Yellow, start searching cabins. But again, they downplayed everything, claimed Rachel could have walked off the ship when no one was looking, except her ID was still in the room. So were her shoes. Who leaves barefoot at dawn in a foreign port? We told them to seal the ship. Don't let anyone disembark until a full search had been done. They refused, said it would interfere with operations. That's the word they used. Operations. Not a person, not a daughter. Just logistics. We started going door to door. It was humiliating, but we didn't care. Some passengers were kind, let us look. Others looked at us like we were intruding on their vacation. Still not one person reported seeing her after dawn. It wasn't until late that afternoon that they began what they called a routine check, which meant walking through the public areas, the hallways, the dining rooms. No cabin searches. No intercom announcements, no police. We begged the ship to call authorities in Curacao. They said it had to go through corporate channels. Legal protocols. That's what they kept falling back on. Meanwhile, time just slipped away. By the next morning, we were out at sea again. No updates, no answers. Tom called the FBI from the satellite phone we had to beg to use. They took the report, but told us the investigation would begin once we returned to port. That same day, we got another report. A bartender said Rachel had been seen at the back of the ship early that morning with a man matching Yellow's build. Said she didn't look afraid, just quiet. But the timing was right. Too right. We tracked down Yellow ourselves. Found him near the crew deck, smoking alone. He didn't seem rattled. When Tom asked if he'd seen Rachel after the club, he said not after 3 a.m., but his eyes didn't hold steady. When Brian pressed him, asked if he walked with her near the elevators, he said no at first, then maybe briefly. Said she asked him something about the sunrise and then kept walking. Security never asked him more than that. He stayed on board for another day, then left the ship at the next port. We found out later he'd switched out with another musician and didn't return for the rest of the cruise. That afternoon, I sat alone in the lounge and stared out at the water. The same water we'd all been excited to see when we boarded. I thought about how Rachel always wore that silver ring on her thumb, the one I gave her when she graduated. I still picture her hands on the railing, that ring catching the light. Back in our cabin, the steward handed me a folded towel in the shape of a swan and said, "I hope your daughter comes back soon." I asked how he knew. He said everybody knows. Just nobody says it out loud. That was the moment I realized. She wasn't just late. She was gone. And whatever happened to her didn't start that morning. It started the minute we stepped onto that ship. Tom called the FBI again once we docked in San Juan. It had been 3 days since Rachel disappeared. They took the report and said they'd be in touch. That was the phrase they used, in touch. We didn't hear back until we were already on the flight home. We'd packed her suitcase without opening it, left her shoes in the closet where she'd last stepped out of them. Brian carried it down the gangway himself, his knuckles white around the handle the whole way. The drive from the airport back to Roanoke felt longer than the cruise. There wasn't a moment of silence that didn't feel wrong. The first time I walked past her bedroom door, I had to stop myself from opening it like she might be in there curled up with a book. But the air in that room felt different now still, and somehow thinner. The local police came by the house a few days later. They said the FBI had forwarded the file, and they'd do what they could to support the investigation. But they made it clear the jurisdiction wasn't theirs. Rachel had gone missing in international waters. That meant U.S. authority was limited. We asked what that meant in practice. They looked down at their notes and said they could collect statements, help coordinate. But unless something turned up on American soil, their hands were tied. I remember Tom staring at the officer for a long moment before saying, "So no one's in charge." The officer didn't argue. He just nodded, like even he knew how useless that sounded. After that, it was mostly us. We started contacting the cruise line ourselves. We asked for camera footage from the deck. We asked for timestamps, logs, anything that could help recreate Rachel's last known movements. Most of what we got were carefully worded emails from someone in guest services, someone who'd never spoken to us in person. They told us the footage from that night had already been overwritten by the ship's automatic cycle. They claimed the delay in reporting made it impossible to preserve. Tom asked if that cycle could have been paused once she was reported missing. The reply didn't answer the question. It just said the company followed standard procedure. We hired a private investigator in Virginia who had experience with maritime cases. He told us right away that cruise ships operate in a gray zone. Different rules, different priorities. He wasn't surprised the ship hadn't made an announcement when she vanished. He said that kind of thing draws attention, affects business. We gave him everything we had. Names, dates, the few witness reports we'd managed to collect on board. He asked us about the man Rachel had danced with. When we told him the nickname Yellow, he raised an eyebrow and said he'd look into it. A week later, he said the cruise band had swapped members mid-trip and that Yellow had signed off early. We weren't given an official reason. People started talking. A former steward messaged Tom anonymously and said that Yellow had been seen with Rachel early that morning near the back stairwell, a staff-only section most passengers didn't even know about. Another couple who'd been on the cruise sent an email saying they'd heard a woman crying around 5 a.m. near the crew quarters. They didn't report it at the time, thought it was a couple fighting. But after seeing Rachel's photo on the news, they weren't sure anymore. Iva, my neighbor down the street, came by with a casserole and said maybe Rachel had decided not to come back. That she was grown, maybe she just wanted to start over somewhere. I remember standing at the kitchen sink, staring at the plate she'd brought, and thinking how many mothers actually believe that their child just vanished by choice, left behind their shoes, their ID, their brother asleep in the same room just to start over. Tom didn't even respond. He walked straight out to the garage and stayed there the rest of the day. A month later, we finally got a call from the bureau. A young woman had been seen in Curaçao matching Rachel's height build, even the way she moved. A cab driver said she'd approached his car, asked to use the phone, looked panicked. Before he could hand it over, 2 men came up behind her and she shut down. Said nothing else. Walked off with them. He didn't report it at the time. It wasn't until he saw a rerun of Rachel's missing persons alert on television that he recognized her. "I'm sure it was her," he said. "That should have triggered a deeper investigation." Instead, the agent said they couldn't confirm it and the window had closed. Too much time had passed, no security footage, no names. Just a memory from a man who now regretted staying silent. We asked them again to subpoena the ship's internal documents, shift logs, keycard data, anything. They said they were trying, but Royal Caribbean said those files were protected under their own internal legal process, that some of them weren't subject to U.S. law. I sat with that information for a long time, just kept reading the same sentence over and over again in the email. Due to proprietary protocols, this information cannot be released without formal litigation. Not "we're sorry," not "we understand." Just legal language. Brian took it the hardest. He stopped returning his friends' calls, moved back in with us for a while. He blamed himself, said if he'd stayed awake, if he'd walked her back to the room instead of just crashing, maybe none of this would have happened. We told him again and again it wasn't his fault. But when you're that close to something and still miss it, there's no convincing yourself otherwise. Then the emails started. One from a user with no name, no subject line. It just said, "She's not gone. Look again." We turned it over to the FBI. They traced it to an internet cafe in Barbados. No camera, no records, another dead end. Still, we didn't stop. We kept her photo out there, sent it to every embassy, every port, started receiving tips from people we'd never met, people who claimed they'd seen a girl with Rachel's tattoo or the silver ring, or just the same walk. Some were well-meaning. Others felt like someone was playing with us. There's something cruel about hope that keeps slipping just out of reach. Something bitter in how quickly official voices go quiet. In the end, it wasn't that no one believed us. It was that they didn't believe she was still worth looking for. But she was. She still is. And a year after the cruise, we finally got a second sighting, this time from someone who said she gave a name. A man in uniform, someone stationed overseas, said a young woman had whispered it to him inside a dim back room where she shouldn't have been. "My name is Rachel Massey. Please help me." That's what he said she told him. Then 2 men pulled her away. He didn't come forward until months later, but he never forgot her voice. The man who claimed to hear Rachel speak her name was a Navy officer. He said it happened in Barbados during shore leave, a dim hallway too narrow for comfort. A girl sitting alone, eyes on the floor, posture tense. She looked up just long enough to speak soft and fast. "My name is Rachel Massey. Please help me." And then she was gone. 2 men appeared, moved in fast, didn't make a scene, just walked her out through a side exit. He didn't follow. He froze. Said he told himself it might have been a mistake or maybe a setup. And by the time he couldn't shake it anymore, weeks had passed and he was back stateside. That was the part that sat heavy with me, that someone heard her voice and still walked away. But I couldn't blame him either. People aren't trained for this. They don't know what to do when something real and terrible drops right in front of them. That sighting unraveled something in our house. Brian started sleeping on the couch. Tom wouldn't answer the phone unless he recognized the number. I stopped cooking dinner altogether. It felt pointless putting food on plates when we couldn't even find the person whose seat used to be there. We waited for more information, but the tip didn't go anywhere. No cameras, no proof. Just a single moment already gone. After that, the calls slowed down. The updates came further apart. And when they did come, it was mostly to say there was nothing new. The agent handling our case told us as gently as he could that the leads were growing colder. I asked him what came next. He said the case was still open but inactive. That was the word they used. Inactive. As if Rachel had just paused. That spring, I started keeping a notebook. Every tip we got, every email, every name, every variation of every sighting. I filled the pages with dates, sketches, maps, quotes, anything I could get my hands on. It didn't matter if they were duplicates or if most of them led nowhere. I just needed to hold it all somewhere. Tom didn't say much about the notebook, but I'd catch him flipping through it late at night, pen in hand, under the soft light above the dining room table. A few months after that, we got a knock on the door from someone we didn't expect. Her name was Judy Branson, and she'd just returned from a trip to the Caribbean. She'd seen Rachel, or someone who matched her down to the voice. Said it happened in the bathroom of a hotel lobby, a quiet corner near the bar. She went in to fix her hair and found a young woman pacing by the sinks. The girl looked nervous, kept glancing at the door. Judy said she offered a smile and asked if she was okay. The woman turned to her real slow and whispered, "My name is Rachel Massey. Please help me." Judy didn't know what to do. She said before she could even open her mouth, 2 men entered. Big locals, silent. The girl dropped her eyes and didn't say another word. They led her out by the elbow like nothing had happened. Judy came home, told her sister. Her sister told her to report it. When she finally found our number, she cried when Tom picked up. That account was more detailed than anything we'd received in over a year. She remembered the woman's voice, the way she looked toward the door every few seconds. She said it didn't feel like someone on vacation. It felt like someone waiting for permission. The FBI added the sighting to the file, but nothing came of it. We asked if they could pull security footage from the hotel. They said the cameras had already been overwritten. Again. That was the point where I stopped trusting official systems. I don't say that lightly. I was raised to believe in law and process and decency. But we were doing everything we were supposed to, and still nothing. No one followed up. No one called Judy back more than once. It was like people were afraid of what they might find if they looked too hard. So we started looking ourselves, quietly. Rachel's photo was already out there in online forums, digital billboards, message boards, in ports and airports. We reprinted it with a different tagline. "Seen this woman?" She may not be able to speak for herself. That phrasing was Tom's idea. It said what we couldn't. I began emailing anyone who'd worked that ship housekeeper's entertainment staff, even vendors. Most didn't reply. A few wrote back short notes of sympathy. But one man who said he'd been part of the kitchen crew mentioned something strange. He remembered seeing a woman crying behind a service door the morning Rachel disappeared. Not loud, just silent tears, head down, hands tucked under her legs. Said a man in a white shirt stood a few feet away, leaning on the railing, watching her without saying a word. When asked if he remembered what the man looked like, he only said he wasn't crew. But he knew his way around. The timeline fit too well. Rachel vanished around 5:30 or 6 a.m. That door, the one near the service corridor, was feet from where that bartender claimed to see her last. When we asked for records of crew keycard logs to verify who'd been on what deck at what time, we were told they couldn't be shared without a legal request. We filed one. It was denied. Brian started calling private investigators in the region. Most of them didn't respond. The one who did warned us that if Rachel had been taken, there were places she could be held where no one, not even law enforcement, would dare poke around. Off-grid, he said. No cameras, no paperwork. Islands no one talks about. I asked how that could be possible with modern technology surveillance satellites. He said those things work when someone wants you to be found. We kept going anyway. Raised money quietly with a friend who had legal connections. One of them knew a man who specialized in Caribbean trafficking cases. Said he'd try to pull what he could. That's when we started seeing patterns we hadn't noticed before. Other families, other girls. A few American, a few not. All vanished near cruise ports, all between the ages of 20 and 30. Most had been spotted at least once, then never again. One woman's sister reached out to me directly. Said she'd been watching Rachel's story for years and believed the 2 cases were connected. Her sister had disappeared out of St. Thomas in '97. Last known location was a bar near the water where she'd gone for a drink before meeting her husband back on the ship. A year later, someone sent them a photo, a blurry image of a girl walking down a back alley in Curacao. She looked just like Rachel, but it wasn't Rachel. It was someone else's daughter, and she was just as gone. I don't know what happens to a family when enough people stop asking questions, but I know what happened to ours. We became the only ones left who hadn't let go, and at a certain point you stop waiting for the doorbell to ring or the phone to light up. You start listening for quieter things, a detail no one noticed, a gap in a timeline, a man who knew his way around but wasn't on any manifest. And in the middle of all that silence, something finally arrived. A pair of photographs sent in an email with no name. The subject line was empty. The return address bounced back within an hour. But the woman in the photo, tired eyes, hollow face, older than her years, had a small Tasmanian devil tattoo on her shoulder. And it was Rachel's. The same exact one I sat with her to get the summer after high school. I remembered how she winced when the artist hit the bone, how proud she was of the tiny, defiant grin on that cartoon face. There was no mistaking it. But there was no way to trace the sender, and once again the trail was already going cold. I forwarded the photos to the FBI the same day we got them. No note, no context. Just 2 low-resolution images attached to a blank message from an untraceable sender. The return address was a string of numbers and characters, something random. But what I couldn't shake was the body language. The girl in the photo was lying on a bed on her side, not quite asleep. Her eyes weren't closed, but they weren't looking at the camera either. It was the eyes. More than anything, they looked past the lens, like someone who wasn't sure if she was being watched or remembered. The tattoos were unmistakable. The Tasmanian devil on her shoulder, the little gecko just below her waistline. Rachel had picked both out herself when she turned 18. We'd driven to Richmond for her appointment. She was nervous, made jokes the whole ride home. And now there they were again, same placement, same ink, only faded like time had dulled the color. I printed them and brought them to our contact at the bureau. He didn't argue. Said the resemblance was strong, but the images had come from a now-defunct website hosted outside the U.S. By the time they tracked the IP, the site had already been scrubbed. We kept coming back to the same question: why send them to us? Why not demand money or leave instructions? It wasn't a ransom. It wasn't a threat. It was just a reminder. Like someone wanted us to know she was still out there, but not how to reach her. That kind of silence changes you. It makes you question everything, including your own instincts. Brian stayed up late that week, going through every email and link he could find. He found archived versions of the site, but the photos were gone. Whatever was up there had been pulled clean. I caught him one night in the garage, sitting on the floor with the laptop open, just staring. He said he'd been trying to match the bedsheets in the photo to hotels in the region. He was down to fabric patterns now. I didn't know what to say. I just sat next to him until he closed the screen. A few days later, we got a name. Not a real one, just a handle. Someone using the name Jazz had been listed in a different photo set from the same site. A user on a forum had archived the listing. They remembered the name because it didn't fit the others, said it stood out. When they clicked the link, it redirected to an error page. We never saw the listing ourselves, but we asked the bureau about it, and one agent confirmed the connection. Whoever Jazz was, she was gone now. No trace, no trail. Just a dead link and an old screen name. But the name came up again months later, this time in an email. Different sender, same pattern, no subject, no signature. The message was short. Said they'd seen a woman matching Rachel's description in a hotel near the docks in St. George's, Grenada. That she called herself Jazz and she wasn't allowed to speak to strangers. Said she looked tired. That she kept checking the lobby door like she was waiting for someone who never came. That's all it said. We gave the lead to a private investigator we'd been working with out of Miami. His name was David Carr. He'd done maritime trafficking cases before, didn't promise anything, just that he'd go take a look. He flew down that week, Met with local contacts, checked the hotel, questioned a few staff. Nobody remembered the girl, but one bartender said something that stuck. He said sometimes women like that don't come and go through the front doors. They're brought in a different way. David dug deeper, found a staff member who mentioned a man who used the name Jazz as well, not as a nickname but more like a title, the way someone might refer to a handler. He said Jazz runs the girls on that end. We asked David what he thought it meant. He said he'd heard the name before once in a trafficking case in Barbados. Same pattern. Girls who vanished, then reappeared under different names, locked into new identities they didn't choose. That changed the way we looked at the photo. We'd assumed Jazz was Rachel's alias. But what if it wasn't hers at all? What if it was his? That night I pulled out Rachel's senior photo, the one she took in her college sweatshirt with her knees pulled up under her. She looked so free in that picture. It's still framed in our living room, but that night I took it to the kitchen, set it next to the photos we'd received in the email, looked at them side by side under the lamplight. You can tell a lot from someone's posture. And Rachel, the real Rachel, always had this openness to her shoulders. She faced people directly like she expected to be heard. But the girl in the bed, she curled inward, just slightly, like someone who'd been taught not to take up too much space. We tried to confirm the gecko tattoo through the FBI's image software, but the resolution was too low. They said they couldn't confirm it with certainty, that the angles weren't reliable enough. I wanted to scream. If we weren't sure that was Rachel, then why did it feel like she was staring right back at me? 2 weeks later, a reporter from an online outlet called us, said she was putting together a feature on disappearances connected to cruise lines, asked if we'd seen the new batch of photos that had surfaced on a Caribbean message board. I told her no. She sent them to me that afternoon. Most were unrelated. Grainy webcam shots, party photos, girls on boats. But in the corner of one cropped poorly, there was a profile that stopped me cold. A woman sitting at an outdoor cafe under a tan umbrella. Back to the street, a drink in her hand. And a man standing just behind her, one hand resting on the top of the chair. I don't know why it stood out. Maybe the stillness of it. Maybe the way her posture echoed the same one in the bed. But this time you could see her face a little more. Just the edge of her jaw, her chin, part of her left eye. And in that eye, that was where I felt it. The same dull watchfulness, like someone had trained themselves not to react. We sent it to David. He said he'd seen the cafe before in Curacao. It had since closed, changed ownership, but he recognized the tiled floor. He flew back the next week, asked around, showed the photo to vendors' waitstaff, anyone who'd been working that strip of shops near the water. Most shrugged, said it was too long ago. But one bartender said something strange. I haven't seen her in a while, he told David, but she used to come in. Quiet girl. Always watched the door. David asked him why he remembered that. The man said she didn't drink much, and she never turned her back to the entrance. Said the way she sat made you think she was waiting for someone or watching out for them. That was the first time I allowed myself to believe what we'd suspected all along, that maybe Rachel hadn't disappeared. Maybe she'd been hidden in plain sight. And if that was true, then she was still alive, still moving, still waiting. But waiting for what or who we still didn't know. David flew back down 2 weeks later. He'd been circling a few addresses near the Curacao docks trying to verify something the bartender said about back entrances and private drop-offs. But what started as a routine follow-up changed the moment a new contact came forward. This man, who didn't give a full name, said he'd worked delivery routes in the hills above the port places. Tourists don't go places where the roads are unpaved and the streetlights don't work. He mentioned a property up there, high-walled, and always quiet, where vehicles came and went with their windows blacked out. He said the people who entered didn't always come back out. David asked what kind of vehicles. The man said mostly vans, silver or white. No plates or plates too clean to be real. There was no signage on the gate. No house number. Just a pale stucco wall and a guard booth that always seemed to be empty until you got too close. The man said he only drove by when he had to, told David not to go alone. That's when we sat down as a family and made a decision. Up until then, we'd worked through legal channels, investigators' official requests. But now we were facing something different, something off the books, the kind of thing no agency was going to touch without hard proof. So we shifted gears, quietly. We met with a former intelligence liaison that one of Tom's old friends from the fire department connected us with. He didn't ask many questions, just listened, took notes, said he'd assemble a small team. Surveillance, only no contact. That was the agreement. No one was to go inside, no confrontations, just eyes and timing and patterns. We wired the funds, sent David everything we had, and waited. The first updates came slow. The team stayed back, watching from hilltop roads, from parked cars with tinted glass, from long lenses behind broken fences. They counted 4 vehicles that entered the compound regularly. 2 men who appeared to be guards, both armed. A woman who brought food in through the back twice a day, and occasionally someone who looked like a driver, tall, thin, always in long sleeves. But there was never any clear sighting of Rachel. They couldn't see past the inner courtyard. Too many trees, too much cover. Still, something about the way the place operated felt off. No one came for leisure, no parties, no deliveries beyond food, and no one stayed for long except the ones who lived there. The report came in at the end of the 2nd week. One of the observers spotted a woman being walked slowly from the rear patio to what looked like an outbuilding's small, low roof unmarked. She was flanked by 2 men. Her head was down. She moved like someone who didn't expect to be seen. From the angle they had, they couldn't confirm her face. But her posture. It matched the photo from the cafe. That slight forward lean, the arms held close to her sides, the way she glanced toward the tree line before stepping inside. David sent us the stills. They were grainy, but when I looked at them, I stopped breathing for a few seconds. Something in the way her foot hovered just before the step, like she'd learned to hesitate before every move, felt like Rachel. We prepared for a follow-up mission. A closer look. Same team. Only this time they'd move in during the early morning hours when the property seemed quietest. They wouldn't go inside, just get close enough to document the layout, count windows, note entry points. The night before they were set to go, we got a message from David. "We're getting close. Something's happening." Then nothing. We didn't hear from the team for 3 days. Phones off. Email servers bounced back. The main contact, the liaison, stopped replying. When David finally called, his voice was tight. He said the compound had been cleared out 2 nights prior. Every vehicle gone. No power. The gate was open when they arrived. The place looked like it hadn't been lived in for weeks. Furniture gone. Curtains removed. Even the trash bins were empty, scrubbed clean. Cameras had been taken off the corners of the house. No paper, no receipts, nothing that would have shown anyone had ever been there. One of David's local contacts whispered something later that week, said he'd heard that someone had gotten wind of the surveillance, that whoever owned the property had eyes everywhere, even in the hills, that the crew watching the place had been seen before they ever got close. It wasn't hard to guess what happened next. David wouldn't speak in detail after that. Whatever he'd uncovered, he was done. Said the risk was too high. That these weren't just men running a side operation. This was organized, protected, trained. We asked him if he thought Rachel had been there. He paused for a long time. Then he said if she was, they moved her fast. And now it'll be twice as hard to find her again. That was the hardest part, knowing we might have been close. That she could have been behind one of those doors. That we had names, faces, coordinates, and it still slipped through. Like everything else in this case, it dissolved just before we could touch it. Tom didn't speak much after that. Brian blamed himself for suggesting we move. Said maybe if we'd just left things alone, they wouldn't have moved her. I didn't argue. I just let him say what he needed to say. Some nights I'd catch him standing by the back door looking out into the yard like he expected headlights to pull into the driveway. But they never did. Weeks passed, then months. The silence settled back in. But I never stopped checking the email account we set up for tips. And one night just after midnight, something new came in. A single message. No attachments. No greeting. It read, "She remembers. But she's afraid." There was no name, no return address, nothing to trace. Just that. And it was enough to pull me back into the fight. Because if she remembered, if she knew who she was, then maybe, just maybe, she was still waiting for us to find her. The message sat in my inbox for 3 days before I told anyone. I must have opened it 50 times. Just 8 words. She remembers. But she's afraid. No punctuation. No signature. Nothing to trace. I didn't forward it to Tom or Brian right away. Didn't call David, didn't alert the agent assigned to our file what was left of it. I just kept reading it over and over until I felt the shape of those words in my chest. The phrasing didn't feel random. It felt like someone had thought about exactly what to say. Not enough to confirm identity. Not enough to accuse anyone, but just enough to let us know Rachel was still in there. Not lost, not gone. Remembering. It was a small thing. But that's how everything in this case started, small things. One word in an overheard conversation. A glance on a crowded stairwell. A tattoo under poor lighting. Each one meant nothing on its own. But together, they were a trail, and we were still following it. I finally brought the message to Brian on a Sunday morning. He didn't say much, just turned the screen toward him and read it. Then he nodded once, like something that had been resting on his shoulders finally made sense. That afternoon, he printed a map of Curacao and taped it to the wall beside the kitchen table. Every old address, every photo location, every place mentioned in a tip or a report, he marked them again like starting from zero. It was Brian who suggested we stop looking for Rachel in tourist areas. If she was alive and if she remembered, she wouldn't be somewhere obvious. She'd be where no one was allowed to ask questions. Places that existed in gaps between towns where properties weren't listed under real names, where electricity was run off portable generators and deliveries were made in unmarked vans. We went back through everything David had collected and we found something we'd overlooked. A mention buried in an old file of a compound west of the docks that had been torn down and rebuilt years ago. But the records around it didn't line up. Building permits didn't match property ownership, and the original blueprints filed under a company called Coral Edge Holdings were missing a signature from the island's planning authority. It meant the structure existed, but legally it wasn't supposed to be there. David agreed to fly back one more time, not to investigate, not officially, just to verify the location, see what had replaced the old compound. When he got there, he found a new structure. Fresh paint, new windows, a tall gate, and the same tree line visible in one of the photos we'd received nearly a year earlier. The same tree Rachel had glanced toward before disappearing into the outbuilding. He didn't go closer. He just watched. For 3 days. On the second night, he saw movement. A woman early 30s, short dark hair, walked along the back terrace and entered through a side door. From the distance, he couldn't confirm it was Rachel. But he said the way she moved reminded him of someone whose body had learned to shrink itself to take up less space than it should. We passed everything to the bureau again. The new photos, the coordinates, the message. We asked them to reopen the case with full priority. Their reply came 3 weeks later. Thank you for the update. The case remains open, but we are not currently pursuing new investigative leads. That was the point when I knew. If Rachel was going to come home, it wouldn't be through official channels. The following month, we were contacted by a journalist named Marianne Cole. She ran a podcast that focused on international disappearances and unsolved maritime cases. Said she'd been following Rachel's case for years and had recently spoken with 2 separate sources who claimed to have seen her both in Curacao, both describing a woman who answered to a name that wasn't hers. Marianne flew out to speak with one of them directly, a woman who worked as a receptionist at a private clinic near the marina. She said a few years back a woman had come in with a man who didn't let her speak. The woman sat quietly in the corner, didn't fill out any paperwork, didn't even look up when her name was called because the man gave the name Isla. She said the woman had a gecko tattoo on her lower back and a thin scar just below her shoulder. I asked Marianne how confident she was in the sighting. She said, "It's the first time I've ever seen someone go pale when they saw a photo." She didn't even need a second look. The man who'd brought Isla to the clinic was described as tall, clean-cut, spoke fluent English, wore long sleeves even in the heat, asked for a prescription refill, and left a cash payment that covered 3 months' worth of medication. No receipt. No insurance. We gave that information to a legal contact of ours who used to work with Interpol. He agreed to push it through informal channels, see if there was anything the local police had logged under that alias. The next time we heard from him, he said the name Isla had come up once in a transport log that had since been deleted, but someone had taken a screenshot. The destination was listed as Celeste Wharf. No country, no time, just a line item that shouldn't have existed. Celeste Wharf wasn't a recognized port. It wasn't on any commercial maps, but Brian found it referenced in a scanned maritime chart from the late 90s, back when that part of the coastline was still being dredged. It had once been a fueling station for fishing vessels later sold to a private company. The chart showed a narrow inlet, 2 structures, and a helipad. We didn't know what it meant, only that Rachel had possibly been moved again. And if she had, the people who were doing this had more power than we understood. It's hard to explain what it's like holding on to someone without knowing if they're holding on to you. You wake up each morning and look for something, a sign, a slip, a small break in the silence. We kept that email, she remembers, but she's afraid. We never replied. We couldn't. But we printed it, taped it to the wall beside the map, and every time the thread began to fray, we looked at it again. Because it meant Rachel was still in there, and we weren't the only ones listening. The map stayed up through the winter, tape curling at the edges, pins holding on through the soft grain of the kitchen wall. Brian added layers over time, sticky notes, clippings, GPS printouts, half-erased coordinates we couldn't confirm. Tom rarely looked at it anymore. He'd sit nearby with his coffee back turned to it, as if ignoring it might make it go away. But I couldn't ignore it. Neither could Brian. We were too far in. Too many names, too many places. Too many people who had come forward and then disappeared into silence. And now we had something else, Celeste Wharf. A name that shouldn't exist on any log, but somehow had. The contact who flagged it had already gone quiet, said it was better not to be involved further. But the phrase kept showing up in archived shipping manifests, in offshore business directories, in freight networks routed through islands that didn't even have customs agents on site. One day, while cross-referencing company names in those records, Brian found a property marker listed under a different alias. Brightway Transport Limited, registered to a cluster of buildings on a narrow inlet west of San Pedro, Belize. It had no physical signage. But there it was in 2 separate databases, both filed within a month of Rachel's last confirmed sighting. There was a pattern, and it was tightening. These weren't just random movements. Someone was shifting her, controlling where she could be seen, when, and for how long. We'd seen the same strategy in other cases. Girls moved from clinic to apartment to safe house and back again. Names changed, papers forged, scars healed. But they never stayed put for long. We debated going ourselves. David said not to, said it was too risky without local support, especially in a place where the lines between law enforcement and organized transport blurred more often than not. So we waited, for weeks, until a man named Elias Moreno reached out. He was a retired security contractor who now worked as a private advisor for families of missing persons. Said he'd heard our story on Mary Ann's podcast and believed it connected to 2 other cases he'd been following, different names, same pattern. Elias wasn't warm, but he was clear. He didn't deal in rumors. He said if we wanted confirmation, it had to be quiet and fast. He asked for a list, dates, last known movements, places where Rachel had almost been seen. I sent him everything. 2 days later, he emailed a photo. It showed a warehouse, white cinder block, no signage, surrounded by overgrowth. Parked in front was a black SUV, tinted windows, engine still running. In the shadow between the vehicle and the building, there was movement. A figure. It was blurry, too distant to identify. But it was a woman, slim build, hair tied back, standing very still. Elias said the image had been taken 5 days earlier, just after dawn. He didn't promise it was Rachel. He didn't promise anything. But he said he was going back that night. One last sweep, just to confirm movement. We didn't hear from him again for 4 days. When he called, his voice was hoarse. He said the building was empty when he returned. Not cleared out, just dead quiet. The locks had been changed. No signs of people inside. But there were 3 mattresses on the floor, a portable burner in the corner, and on the windowsill an orange wristband. Plastic. Torn. The kind used for patient identification. He brought it back with him. Sent it to a lab in Houston that offered private DNA testing. The results came a week later. The sample was partial, faint, degraded from heat, but enough to run against Rachel's hairbrush. The match came back inconclusive. The technician told us it wasn't a yes, but it also wasn't a no. It was a maybe with teeth. The kind of result that would haunt you if you walked away from it. At that point, Tom requested another meeting with the Bureau. We brought everything, Elias's footage, the patient band, the shipping logs, even the metadata from the photo of the woman behind the SUV. We handed them over calmly. We said, "This is the closest we've ever been. We need you to act." The agent, to his credit, didn't dismiss us. He said he'd escalate the file, but he also told us something we weren't ready to hear. That without a verified sighting or a physical address tied to criminal activity, they couldn't launch an international operation. They'd forward the report to the embassy. That was all they could do. The word embassy sounded like the end of a hallway with no doors. That week, Brian stopped updating the map. He didn't take it down, just stopped adding to it. The pins stayed where they were, but the note cards began to yellow in the sun. And the emails, well, they slowed too. Leads dried up. Messages went unanswered. Even Mary Ann said she was stepping back from the case. Not because she didn't believe in it, but because the more attention it got, the quieter people became. She said sometimes the only thing worse than being ignored is being seen by the wrong eyes. And then quietly, Royal Caribbean reached out. Not the media team, not the attorneys. A single liaison we'd never spoken to before. She asked to meet in person. We agreed. The meeting took place in a small conference room at a federal building in D.C. She didn't offer condolences. She didn't admit wrongdoing. But she did hand us a manila envelope. Inside were 3 internal reports. They were redacted, full of legal language, incomplete. But one paragraph stood out. It described an incident from the night Rachel disappeared. A crew member logged an informal complaint about a fellow employee, someone acting inappropriately familiar with a passenger, and attempting to escort her through a restricted access corridor near the service deck. The employee's name was omitted, but the complaint had been filed at 5:12 a.m. We had never been told that. Not once. We asked who had written it. The liaison didn't answer. We asked what had happened to the employee. She said she wasn't authorized to disclose personnel decisions. Then she left. I sat with that envelope in my lap for a long time before opening it again. I kept returning to that timestamp, 5:12 a.m. That was the same window the bartender said he saw Rachel near the railing. The same window the steward said he heard quiet crying from behind the service door. The same window we'd always circled but never been able to fill. Now it had a shape, a complaint, a report, a missing name. That night, I laid all the documents out on the dining room table and went back through every interview transcript we'd collected. And one thing jumped out. A name we hadn't followed up on. A temporary entertainment staffer who'd signed on mid-cruise. Short contract, off-boarded early, went by a nickname. We'd been told he was cleared, that he'd given a brief statement and left nothing behind. But now I wasn't so sure. The more I looked at the timeline, the more I saw it gaps in when he was on shift, contradictions in his story missing badge scans on the crew manifest. His name was never officially redacted, but it also never showed up again. And something about the way his name kept vanishing felt like the next place we needed to look. The first time I said his name out loud, it barely felt real. Not because it was unfamiliar, we'd had it in our notes since the second month, but because it had been buried so deep in the paperwork, so surrounded by silence, it was like pulling a thread from a sweater you didn't know had come undone. Nico Renner, that was the name. Hired as a seasonal assistant in the onboard entertainment team. Contracted for 2 weeks. Left after 8 days. No forwarding address. No completed exit paperwork. We hadn't flagged him at first because he gave an interview the night Rachel went missing. Said he'd seen her leave the pool deck around 3 a.m. That lined up with other accounts, so the agent marked it as consistent. But we'd never spoken to him ourselves. His name sat in the stack like hundreds of others, until it didn't. Elias ran the first background pull for us. Then David confirmed it. Renner's employment records didn't exist in the cruise line's HR system. There was a shell profile, sure. Name, birth date, ID, badge number. But no tax filings, no scanned passport, no onboarding documents. The kind of profile you build when you want someone visible but not traceable. The more we looked, the stranger it got. He had worked similar short stints on 2 other ships. Each time he left early. Each time something minor had been logged, a passenger complaint, a schedule dispute, a service corridor left unsecured. Nothing that screamed criminal. Just friction, noise. And then in 2017, nothing. He vanished from every maritime record. No forwarding contracts, no next of kin. Just a flat line. We submitted all of it quietly to the Bureau's internal review office. They never said what they did with the file. But 6 months later we got a letter. Not from them. From a woman in Tampa who'd worked security detail on the Celeste Wharf property during its final months of operation. She said she recognized the name. Nico Renner had been there. Not as staff, but as someone who came and went often always at night, always through the loading gate. Said she remembered him because he had a limp barely noticeable, but enough that it changed the way he moved. She didn't know his real role. Just that when he showed up, people stayed out of the hallway. She wrote that she didn't know where Rachel was, but she believed we were close, closer than we'd ever been. There's no perfect end to this kind of story. No sudden justice, no courtroom applause. There are only small certainties. This happened. This mattered. This person was taken from the life they were trying to live, and the people who loved them were told to move on. I didn't move on. I moved with it. That's different. Rachel's case is still open. Technically, it sits under a multi-jurisdictional watch list flagged for further intelligence correlation, which means if she ever re-enters a documented system hospital passport fingerprint match, it'll ping. But it hasn't yet. And maybe it won't. But that doesn't mean the story stops. Not for me. Not for Brian. Not for Tom, even on the days he can't look at the map. Some days I still check the inbox. There are fewer emails now. Quieter ones. But every once in a while someone writes. A sister, a cousin, a friend of someone who vanished without the world noticing. And they ask the same question. How did you keep going when everything told you to stop? And I never have a simple answer. But I always come back to this. There's power in refusing to forget. There's dignity in naming what was done, even if the world calls it unsolved. If you listened this far, thank you. If Rachel's story stayed with you, maybe share it. maybe say her name out loud, so no one gets to decide she never mattered.